Yo, welcome to The Noob and the Knower. In this podcast, we pair a driven beginner with a seasoned vet to explain how to learn basically anything.
This season's anything is how to fly fish. Stick around as we cover the gamut, 101 to the 401, gear, reading water, fishing techniques, and much, much more.
With star of hit video series Modern Nymphing, Fly Fishing Team USA medalist, and professional guide Lance Egan.
That's right. And here co-hosting and asking the questions on your behalf is avid fly fisher and recently graduated noob, Pablo Signori.
So let's go. Together we'll take you from fishing zero
to fly angling hero faster than you can say, fish on.
Season 1, Episode 8. We are here with the legend, Lance Egan, Lance frickin' Egan, ladies and gentlemen, and Mr. Ray Bly. Ray. Say hello, guys, at the same time.
What's
Hello.
up?
All right. Everybody doing good?
Yeah.
Everybody's doing well here except for that legend part. I don't know about that.
Oh, dude, come on now.
I was waiting for the audience to answer that one.
Yeah, there you go. We're doing great. Oh, man. We've just been chit-chatting here. Ray got here early, and he gave me a bunch of flies because I'm going to take my cousins to do some smallie fishing on the Huron in Michigan. And shout out to Bettina. What's up, girl? I'm going to try and get her on some fish this weekend, so we'll have you guys posted on that in the next podcast. Probably not going to happen, but hey, you know, I'm trying to stay positive. But yeah, he saved me a lot of time with that because I was going to tie a bunch of flies, and he was like, oh, I got a bunch of flies right here.
Yeah.
That's how he rolls. That's how he rolls.
I just carry my fly boxes around with me just in case.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty cool. You know, he goes to the DMV. He's got fly boxes, and
I got the flies on lock.
yes. All right, well, today we are talking about nymphing. The last podcast we did dry fly fishing. Now the next technique is all about nymphing. Of course, we've talked a bit about it before on the podcast, but today we're actually going to like get our hands dirty with this and really kind of learn what it's all about. It's going to be a 2-part podcast. We're going to do nymphing in general, and then the next one we're going to talk about the new hot topic, not necessarily new, but pretty hot topic in fly fishing these days called European style nymphing, which Lance is the OG on that subject, so we gotta pick his brain as much as we can. Yeah, so we have a lot to look forward to. I kind of wanted to start out talking about nymphing because I have kind of a personal connection to it because I caught my first trout on a nymph, as most people do. But I'm going to give a shout out to Troy Royan on the Holston River. He was my guide. I went out there for a bachelor party, and everyone ditched me. I've told this story before, how everyone ditched me, and they were just like, yeah. Well, Troy took me out. He's an awesome guy. We've actually, what's kind of crazy, and I just thought of it, Lance, right before we started, I was like, oh, I got something I forgot I wanted to say. I was watching your live, it was like a live tutorial on fly fish food on YouTube on Euro nymphing. It was probably like, I don't know. I was in LA, so it was probably like 2-3 years ago, maybe.
Oh, it was the classroom setting.
Exactly.
Style. I got you. Yeah, I follow.
So it was the first time I had actually watched you guys, and I was in the comments, and I can't remember. I said something, and then actually Troy was on there too, and he's like, "What up, Pablo?" And I'm sure he was like, cool. This is sick. Like this kid who was a total noob, because the first time I ever even picked up a fly rod was with him.
That's awesome.
So I'm sure he was just like, oh my gosh. And then he was like, dude, he's like, what's going on? So cool to see you on here. So it was probably pretty satisfying for him as a guide to see me now, you know, flash forward. At that point, it would have been like 2 years later or something on the forum there. And so you're the bringer of people together in a very wholesome environment.
Getting more people on the river is just what we need.
That's true. You guys bring people together.
That was Troy. I blame Troy for that one. That wasn't my fault.
That's hilarious. Yeah, that's a good point.
Kidding. We welcome everybody, just not right next to us.
That's fair. As long as you can't see them, they're welcome.
That's their welcome.
Yeah.
Do not high hole.
This is Pisces, Varies, an NATK segment where I, Jen Ripple, define fishy words for you. Boom! High hole, verb, fly fishing jargon. To high hole someone is to walk upstream and poach any productive-looking fishable water directly upstream of them. Example in context. A geologist on his way to study a far-off meteor had traversed molten deserts, climbed jagged mountains, and spent months and months bobbing across the expansive sea. When he finally reached the climax of his arduous journey and was face to face with that gigantic dimple on the face of the earth, he turned to it and he said, "Hi, ho!"
that time when I did the nymphing, he got me on some fish, and I was indicator nymphing off a boat. We were floating the Holston, and he put me on fish, and that was really cool. And then after that, I kind of, never used the nymph again for a while because I was fishing around here. Because I'm a snob. No, I actually happened to make a bunch of friends, Ray included. Not a bunch, 2. And
hey, that's a lot for me. I don't know how that works out in Chicago, but
I mean, it's a lot for me too because I don't have any more friends except for the 2 in this room.
That's all you need. 2 good friends.
Yeah. I had 2. I lost 1, but now I got you, Lance. I was doing basically streamer fishing because that was kind of like what was called for the environment and the fishery. And then steelhead season came around here in the Great Lakes. This was before I had moved to LA the second time. So I was in Chicago, and it was steelhead season. And what a lot of people do here is that they nymph fish with indicators for steelhead. So I went out with my homie Ryan C. Rowan, who's a great dude, who's also good friends with Ray, and he basically set me straight, and he got me on some steelhead. Actually, he got me on a huge fish that still is my profile picture. If you guys ever see that, that was not me catching that by myself. It was actually having someone really, really good be like, there's a gigantic fish over there. I can see it. I was like, I don't see anything except for rushing water at the time. But we got the right drift, and the fish took, and it was a battle, and the thing was huge, and still the biggest steelhead I've caught to date. So
wow, that's cool.
That was all on nymphing. Interestingly enough, the nymphs that we were using, which is kind of common here, it was an egg pattern, which is, as you know, Lance, quite contentious to some people, but to us is totally fair game.
Mm-hmm. Fish food.
It's fish food. So yeah, that's kind of that was my intro to nymphing. And then I'm going to save my Euro story for part 2 because that one was when things really clicked.
Part 2.
Part 2.
And the Euro segment, it has to be part 2.
That's true.
Part 2.
Nymphing. Part 2.
Très bon.
Très bon. But yeah, so I'll save that one for the next one. So
Sounds
anyways,
good.
Nymphing, let's talk a little bit about this. Let's just, maybe you can tell us exactly what it is again, because I know we've said it. At this point, I think we've brought nymphing up at least 2 or 3 times, pretty in depth, but again, the whole purpose of this podcast is to teach people. So we need to just drill all these concepts in their head, get them super familiar with it. So give us a rundown on this nymphing subject.
I think we've decided that we're lumping basically anything subsurface into nymphing, because you could fish nymphs near the bottom, you could fish nymphs right below the surface. So subsurface flies that you are not, aside from streamers, let's say. So we kind of, I think, lumped in wet flies even into nymphing of sorts. You could also swing wet flies, which would be a little different than standard nymphing. But generally speaking, with nymphs, we're fishing flies that can be imitative or attractors that are fished mostly near the river bottom, occasionally suspended, and there are lots of different ways to rig them, but we're trying to get them to drift naturally the same speed as the current and somehow stay in contact with them, whether that's with a strike indicator or by feel or by watching colored part of a leader and so on. So we're fishing subsurface to where we won't often see the take versus a dry fly that floats on the surface where we will see all of that take place.
Right, the take being when the fish takes the fly, right?
Fair enough.
This is going to be kind of a blanketed statement. I know that it's not 100% true, but I would say it's 92.7% true, maybe, that most nymphs are weighted in some way, shape, or form. Even if the hook is heavier, it still counts, right?
I would think that's true. Yeah, that's fair enough. Most, I get you don't have to tie them on nymph hooks, but most nymph flies, most patterns that are nymphs are commercially tied on nymph hooks, which are heavier wire, to your point. Some are actually, they add lead wire to the shank before tying the fly, and then they cover the lead wire. More common these days is to add a brass or tungsten bead to the hook to make them a bit more dense. So yeah, they're usually designed to sink in some way or another, but that you could also add weight to the leader, split shot or something like that to help them sink.
That's where the other 7.3% comes in, right?
That's where the 7.924.
Let's talk about when is a good time to nymph, because all these tactics have a time and a place, and nymphing obviously does too. I know that maybe you should tell us, obviously, when is a good time to do it, but also what are the advantages of doing it, disadvantages of doing it, etc.
So I would argue that just about any time is a good time to nymph. I will say that with one caveat, and that is most people, myself included, love to fish dry flies when you can. So maybe the time to not nymph is when you could catch just as many or more fish, or somewhere in that neighborhood,
right,
close to as many fish on dries when there's a hatch prevalent.
I should stop you there and also say, with everything that Lance just said, he's talking about trout specifically. Correct?
Fair enough.
Other species don't take nymphs necessarily.
Or at least as readily.
Exactly. Thank you, Ray. Marlin's not going to take your nymph.
You want to fish a size 22 for your blue marlin?
No, that's a good point. I think it's worth mentioning. We should probably mention it lots of times through the podcast, but we're always basically talking about trout unless we specify otherwise.
That's a good point. Yeah. That's a great way of putting it.
So trout do, generally speaking, it's pretty well established, and everybody knows that studied trout, that they do more than 90% of their feeding subsurface. And most people that really study it would tell you it's probably more like high 90s percentage-wise. As much as we like to think trout are really surface feeders, and they certainly will take off the surface, they don't do very much of their feeding percentage-wise from floating insects. Most of it is stuff below the surface of the water. So nymphing is almost always the most productive way. Not always, there's always a catch, right? But there are no hard set rules. But generally speaking, nymphing produces the most fish day in, day out.
Right, and I'll add to that too, which is something that I've said previously. But these fish don't have hands, so the only way they can check something out is with their mouth. So a lot of times, if you're nymphing and you have something that maybe the fish doesn't recognize as food, it might actually still check it out just because it's trying to see what it is, if that makes sense. I mean, it probably wants to think it's food, but it could be like, is that a twig or is that a cased caddis, or you know what I mean? So
yeah, I'm with you. I think you could also apply some of that logic to dry flies. I think they'll sometimes eat a dry fly that's not really looking much like anything they're eating, but it looks like it could be food and piques their interest, and they check it out. Same with the streamer, same with the wet fly. But I'm with you. Nymphs, they are you can catch them on a wide variety of nymphs that are sometimes looking like nothing they would naturally eat.
You've talked about when's a good time to nymph pretty much all the time. So there's really no bad time to nymph when you're fishing for trout.
Yeah, as far as when water temperatures are safe and not frozen, and outside of extremes when you shouldn't be fishing or can't be fishing.
Right.
Yeah, then any other time. Whether I live in a place here in Utah where I can't think of a river that closes through the wintertime anyway. We have a few tributaries that close for spawning fish, but outside of that, there are places to fish 365 days a year, and we do that. We fish all year long, and we fish nymphs all year long, and then we fish streamers and dries and things when appropriate and when very effective.
Right, and I think it should be noted also that this is something that I didn't learn till a lot later, and things kind of clicked when I had heard this. But a lot of times, like let's just take like this year's Brood X cicada madness that's happening. All these cicadas are flying around. You would think that the trout would just be hitting them on top the whole time, but a lot of these things fall in the river, they drown, and they'll be 2 feet underneath the water, spinning around with the current, and the trout are eating those too. So a lot of times, if there's some sort of hatch or anything like that, you can catch fish on nymphs because there's a bunch of those things actually drowned in the river as well.
Cool.
Now, is that like would you, not to play the devil's advocate, but is that more of like a drowned like kind of spinner situation, or like you're drowning a wet fly or a dry fly? Or
specifically, I was thinking of, there's like a pattern that I learned from George Daniel actually. Mm-hmm. It's like a sunken ant pattern, and he actually has a sunken cicada also.
Cool.
But they're basically a terrestrial or some sort of insect that normally you would assume would not be underwater. It's not born out of water. Mm-hmm. But since they fall in, sometimes they break the meniscus and they get caught in the current, and fish readily eat them because they're just like drowned insects. It's just the same
absolutely.
Insect.
Fair.
Pisces, berries, boom. Meniscus, noun, scientific term. A meniscus is the curved upper surface of a liquid. Example in context. I'm working on a comic about alien dogs, hypersonic gerbils of the fourth kind, and lizard people. The rulers of each of their planets are Rufiscus, Gerbiscus, and Meniscus, respectively.
To your point, they would more commonly float on the surface, but they certainly fall in places where, let's just say a tiny ant that would normally land on the surface and float for miles falls in right where a wave is curling in a riffle, and it immediately gets pushed underwater, and then it doesn't come back up. It's not able to swim, so it gets pushed downward with the current and drifts along until a trout picks it off, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right.
Same with the hopper. Same with I sometimes catch hoppers in the summer and throw them in the stream, and it's amazing how often some of them you throw them in the wrong place and you're looking for it to float down the river and it's like 6 inches under right out of the gates.
Interesting.
It happens quite a bit.
Yeah.
Is that something you do a lot? Just grab hoppers and start throwing them at the river?
I don't like hoppers, so I make sacrifices to the trout.
Game over.
I see. That's
No, I don't do it a lot, but I do it. It's fun to do when they're on a high density stream, where you have a lot of trout. It's fun to catch some hoppers in my net, especially if I have my kids with me, and throw them in and watch the fish eat them.
Oh, that's cool.
I even tangent here, but I even one time got a little crazy and got the fly craft out and went and floated one of our local rivers. But before I did that, maybe 5 days earlier, I think I ordered 1,000 large crickets online, like for food. For a pet, right?
Yeah.
From a cricket grower. And we had this 5-gallon bucket full of crickets, and you can't fish because if you're fishing at the same time, you're chumming, so that's illegal. So we had no fishing gear on the boat, but I just rode my kids down the river and had them throw like handfuls of crickets out ahead of the boat, and then I'd slowly drift down a little bit and then watch the fish come up and eat them.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
It was pretty fun.
That's insane.
I kind of want to try that now.
Yeah.
I was trying, my plan was I'm trying to get my son is the oldest of my 2 kids, and I'm trying to get him to visualize what I want him to do when he's out there, throwing a fly around, and how it needs to drift with the current, and that the fish will just come up because there's food available, sort of a thing, rather than just having him out there flinging a fly around aimlessly.
Yeah.
I kind of want him to visually see what's taking place. Anyway, that's a little extreme, and those poor crickets all met their drown. They either drowned or got eaten, but
they're gonna eat one way or the other.
The trout were fat and sassy. Yeah, I don't know if they would prefer a lizard, maybe a red-bearded dragon, a garter snake, or a trout, but they're going down one way or another.
That's cool. That's a cool thing to do. I'll have to try that with my nephews.
Well, when you run out of crickets, you just float the rest of the way, and it's a fun river float anyway, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's true. I'm going to try that, but I'm going to do it tubing. I'm going to put all the crickets inside my tube.
I hope you have a good seal around your swimming trunks.
Let's talk about seasons and nymphing. Again, you've said that there's not really a bad time to nymph, but maybe there's some seasons that are better for nymphing, or maybe not. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's variable depending on the river. I would argue in freestone streams, it's better fishing overall, not just nymphing, but shoulder season to warmer months, generally speaking, where when it's really bitter cold, it's probably not very good fishing with anything. Again, this all varies depending on where you live and how the water temperatures are and that sort of thing. Around here, where we fish a mix of freestones and tailwaters all year, and then mostly tailwaters in the wintertime, nymphing is really productive all year. That said, when the water is a more tolerable temperature for trout, let's say it's 50 to 60 degree water temps, for instance, the trout are much more likely to move to take stuff. There are lots more hatching insects. There are caddis, there are mayflies, there are stoneflies that are emerging, swimming in some cases towards the surface. And the trout in warmer temps have a higher metabolic rate. They're more active. They're more willing to move in the water column to take stuff. Versus in the wintertime, when water temps are 38, 39 degrees, you might have to hit fish right on the forehead almost, not literally, but you got to get it an inch or two from their face before they're willing to move to eat it. They're not going to swim up in the column 3 feet like they might in the summer to take an emerging insect, because they're losing more energy there than they're gaining to eat a tiny little midge pupa, for instance.
Probably I would imagine the opposite is the case. If the water is starting to get really warm, maybe they'll
slow right back down.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And maybe they would go to deeper water where it's colder, and that's where you'd have to hit them with some nymphs probably too.
They could go shade. They could go, around here when the water gets really warm, they often just go in super fast water because it has more oxygen in it.
Interesting. Okay. Have you found that around the world, or is that just the local type thing?
I haven't fished a lot of places in super, super warm temperatures because, most of the time if it's bordering on too warm to fish, I just won't fish for them. I don't want to stress the fish.
Right.
But when you start, I've fished in the east, for instance, eastern U.S. in months where the water temps by afternoon are starting to push those limits. Let's say mid to high 60s, and the fish are actually still pretty active, but they're not as willing to chase stuff as they would be if the water was 58, 60 degrees versus 65 plus. They start to decline in their metabolic rate, it seems like.
Okay.
Certainly over 70, really even I would say 70, you should probably just not be fishing anymore.
Right. All right, now let's talk about why you want to do some nymphing.
Yeah, well, there's lots of reasons to do it. Mostly the trout spend most of their time living near the river bottom in a river situation anyway. Lakes would be a little different, but they live near the river bottom where the current, they hang in a break, usually in the current behind a large boulder or in a little depression in the river or on an eddy where there's slower currents, something like that, and they allow the current to bring them food, and that food is in the form usually of aquatic invertebrates, nymphs in this case. So those could be midge larvae and pupa, those could be caddis larvae and pupa, those could be stonefly nymphs, those could be mayfly nymphs or mayfly emergers, those could be crustaceans like sow bugs and scuds, they could be even juvenile crayfish, there's leeches, there's all kinds of things that can live, annelids, aquatic worms, things that could live in the bottom of the river. So why would they do it? They would, because they're taking advantage of the most prevalent food sources.
Good answer.
Here's why trout feed on nymphs. No, that's how they live, right? That's how they survive.
Yeah.
They very seldom get to eat a T-bone. They're mostly living on sunflower seeds all day, every day. So they just have to keep eating small, tiny little nymphs over and over and over. So they're always on the lookout for food. So the big why is because that's where most of their food is found, right? That's why fish are feeding near the bottom of the river, and that's why we're going to fish nymphs, because that's a very productive way to fish. Nymphs live on the bottom of the river for the most part, whether that's in weeds, moss, rocks, silt. They can be in all kinds of places in the river. And nymphs instinctually end up doing what, I think we've talked a little bit about this before, but they have what's called behavioral drift, where they just, for some reason, let go of the river bottom and drift downstream. They also have what's called catastrophic drift, which would be they're sitting on a rock holding on, just minding their own business, and then, flows from a dam get increased, or snowmelt starts and certain sudden purge of water comes down and pushes them off their rock, and they get dislodged, and then they have to find their way back to the bottom. And most of the nymphs are pretty poor swimmers. There are exceptions to that rule, but most of them don't swim particularly well. They're kind of neutral buoyancy, so they don't automatically sink right back to the bottom. They have to kind of find their way back to the bottom. So that can take a while.
What about the Phelps and Nympkia?
That's one of those swimming nymphs.
It's a mayfly swimmer, Phelps and Nympkia.
The Isonychias, are they good swimmers?
I don't know, actually.
The Michael Phelps of the mayfly world, are they? We don't have them out west here, so I don't know how good of a swimmer they are. They look, I think, thinking about it, they look more like a clinger style to me, but I could be remembering the wrong mayfly.
Stage 5 clinger.
Anyway, nymphs end up in the drift, and fish, trout particularly, take advantage of them while they're in the drift.
Right. Okay.
So that's a great reason to imitate that, and therefore when you have proper imitations on and you drift them in water that holds fish, and you drift them at the speed of the current that the nymphs would naturally drift, voila, you have some fish on the line.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's pretty deadly, and a big part of nymphing, which we're about to get into, is because, when we say subsurface, most people are thinking, oh, it's just like under the water, but there tends to be an area in the water where they can be found anywhere, but you'll catch a lot of fish closer to the bottom. And with that kind of headspace, let's kind of start moving towards, how you do it. What's the setup, and how important is weight and all these things when we're talking about nymphing. So let's just go with the basic setup for starters. If I'm a beginner and I'm trying to do nymphing, we're going to save Euro nymphing for the next podcast. So let's just say your basic indicator rig.
Right.
How would you get someone started on that?
Depending on where you're fishing, most common would be, let's say, a 9 to 10 foot 4, 5, or 6 weight, with just a good old 905 kind of being the most common workhorse trout rod.
905 being 9 foot 5 weight.
5 weight. Thank you for that clarification.
Right.
Yep.
It's not the bus that you take from Addison to the lake. That's the 152.
That's not the highway. Nope. So, yeah, 9 foot 5 weight is most common if you were fishing for really large fish or using really large flies or dealing with a lot of wind. You might err towards the 6 weight end of things for trout. And if the trout tended to be smaller, or you wanted to protect lighter tippets, or you just liked the slightly lighter rod, you might lean more towards a 4 weight. The 5 kind of bridges the gap and therefore is the most popular.
Just for the listeners, when I was talking about doing it with steelheading, it's the exact same rig except just beefed up. So I had an 8 weight rod, and I think I was fishing like 1 or 2x tippet, 9-foot leader, and because the flies tend to be a little bit bigger, the indicator is also a little bit bigger. They come in different sizes. Well, they come in like a myriad of different styles as well, which we'll talk a little bit about.
So then you need a reel to match your rod. Right. You need, by that we need
pink
one that's
and pink, right?
capable of, not color-wise. Could be pink if you want, but
sure.
Needs to be capable of holding the proper amount of backing. Usually 50 to 100 yards of backing for trout fishing is plenty. It needs to hold a fly line that matches your rod. So if you had that 5-weight rod, you're going to put a 5-weight line on it, maybe some 100 yards or so, 20-pound backing. So you're going to get a reel that matches that, and then you need to add some sort of leader material to the setup. So most common is to use just a tapered leader that you can buy from any fly fishing store that has fly fishing products. Tapered leaders usually are 7.5 to maybe 10 feet in length. They can get a little shorter, they can get a little longer, but 7.5 to 9 foot would be most common. And most people, I think, just grab one of those leaders, attach it to their floating fly line. We should mention a lot of people get confused with nymphing. Since we're fishing subsurface, there are a few that think it's best done maybe with a sinking line or a sinking tip line, and it generally speaking is not. You have a lot more control.
Great point.
As far as your drag and how your drift, your presentation of the flies goes with a floating line, because you can manipulate that floating line on the surface, versus if the line sinks or has a sinking tip, you lose the ability to manipulate the line and get a better drag-free drift on your nymphs. Anyhow, so you've got your floating fly line, you have a leader on there, and then you're going to add a fly or flies, depending on how your rules and laws allow.
What about the indicator? Did you skip that?
I'm going to get there, yeah. You could add an indicator first. Some indicators, to your point, maybe have to go on before the flies. Most of them can go on after the flies.
Okay, sorry.
I want to talk about the indicator.
Okay, Pablo wants to talk about the indicators. So the indicator is basically a fly fisherman's bobber, right? It's a strike indicator. Likes to call them a bobber, but they really are just basically a bobber. Our buddy George Daniel likes to call them a suspension device.
That's true, he does.
Which is interesting because they don't always suspend stuff, but they sometimes do.
Why don't they? When do they not?
Well, if you have something that's if you wouldn't use an indicator in a Euro setup, but if you're, I guess I would argue, if you're fishing like a bounce rig, it's not necessarily suspending your nymphs because you're still in contact with the bottom, so they're not. Your weights are bouncing along bottom, your indicators on the surface, and you kind of got a tight line between, but it's not necessarily, they're not suspended in the current completely. They're at tension because they have weight on the bottom and floating device on the surface.
Interesting. Okay. Okay.
Or that's neither here nor there. It's
semantics.
Just technicality.
Yeah. I like it though. I like it.
But it is something that can be used to suspend nymphs without a doubt, right?
Sure.
So the strike indicator floats. Sorry, George. We love you, man, but suspension device. Pablo says it's not a good description. Ray?
I did not say anything.
Oh, Pablo didn't say anything. That might have been me. It's hard to say. Ray, what say you? I'm putting everybody on the spot. It doesn't really matter. We love George.
George isn't going to listen to this. Don't worry.
He will. He'll listen. Suspension device is a great way to call it.
I've just heard suspension devices used for other things.
That's true. Isn't that like the hooks you put in your back and you kind of like float around and
I've heard about
it's supposed
that.
to feel good after the pain subsides?
No.
Working in a fishing store, I remember the first time I had people come in and ask for large stainless steel hooks, and I'm like, "Oh, are you going saltwater fishing?" And they're looking at me like, "I don't fish." I'm like, "Sorry, you're in a fishing store asking for fish hooks. My bad."
Right.
You're at the wrong place here. Somebody comes in looking for a suspension device at my fly shop, I'm going to look at them a little sideways.
Now you're going to be like, you want a strike indicator or you want to hang yourself by your piercings? Which one is it?
That's probably how it looks at me when I go to the salon and I ask her for human hair to tie flies.
That might be even. That's even weirder, I think. Yeah.
Wow. All right.
You want to do what?
My brother through the pandemic did not cut his hair. He grew his hair down like to his shoulders. It looked ridiculous, and it's been this joke because he's like a New York City attorney, right? So I'm like, I have to tie Mario Klausers. Like, I need to do this. So he went to get his hair cut. He didn't save me any. I was so pissed.
They're not brittle. They're not strong enough hairs for the clouser. It's more like craft fur.
Yeah, that's my point. His hair's so thin and like wavy, like it's like got like a nice like movement to it. I was like, this would be so good.
I have been tasked. This is a little bit gross too, but I've been tasked. The second fly shop I ever worked in, I tied most of their custom fly patterns.
Yeah.
And I had a customer that had a female friend that cut all of her hair basically to where it was really short, and she saved some for him. She fly fishes, he fly fishes, to have some flies tied with it. And he didn't know what to do with it, so he brought it into the shop and he basically commissioned me to do whatever I could with it. So I tied several different styles of flies. She had long brown hair, and it was, I have to admit, it was a little bit awkward.
That's crazy.
Tying with human hair seemed a little strange, but
especially since you kept smelling it and being like, oh, it's so nice, it's so nice. You kept petting it also. That was weird. I remember.
Is that Paul Mitchell or is that Head and Shoulders?
That's hilarious. That's so gross.
That's gross. I did none of those things. It was strange. Being a little bit of a germaphobe, I have to admit, I tied flies and washed my hands several times afterward.
Put the rubber gloves on to tie those flies.
It was a little bit weird, yeah, but it did happen. Anyway,
that's a great story.
How did we get on human hair? I don't know how we got here.
Suspension devices.
That's right.
Suspension. We went from George Daniel. We went from George, our buddy George, to human hair, tying flies to human hair. We have no idea how we got here. Anyway, so we have our leader. We need usually some tippet if we're going to fish multiple flies. Leaders in fly fishing are generally tapered. Tippet material is generally level. Mm-hmm. If you're fishing more than one fly, which most places you can fish 2 flies, some you can fish 3. There are a few places that only let you fish 1. If you're fishing multiple flies, you're going to use tippet between the flies. And then most of the time you need to add some sort of weight. So I've seen everything from lead, like wire and tape wrapped on leaders. I've seen copper sleeves. I've seen tin shot, bismuth, tungsten weights. Lead weight is most common, right? But
what's bismuth?
Bismuth is like
I know it's like it's on the periodic table, isn't it?
I don't know exactly what it is. It didn't really catch on. For a while there, when everybody was going non-toxic, bismuth was one of the non-toxic options. It didn't catch on, I think, because it's brittle and doesn't stick to leader and tip it very well, but anyhow. So yeah, you're going to add some sort of weight to the leader, most commonly lead in its various forms. Split shot is most common.
Right.
That's going to help your flies get down to the bottom, and then you're going to add that strike indicator, that floating device, up the leader a ways, and then you can add or subtract weight, use larger or smaller indicators as the case may be, as situation necessitates. So less weight for shallower or slower water, more weight for deeper, faster, bigger indicator to hold up more weight, suspend. Do you like that word, George? Mm-hmm. Suspend more weight.
Human hair.
Human hair. And a smaller indicator to make less of a splash on the water and be a little more subtle, yet still holding, giving you something to look at visually so you can detect strikes, and hopefully giving a little surface tension to keep you in contact.
Let's talk about these indicators, though, because I know they come in a bunch of different like styles and forms, and there's like the thingamabobber, you got the pinch-on ones, you have the New Zealand strike indicator,
the wool,
the wool style. What am I
airlocks?
Missing? Oh, right, the airlocks,
the Corcos.
Foam or cork, like football style indicators. You have Pat Dorsey style yarn indicators.
Right.
You have the foam octopus style indicators, they call them sometimes.
There's also those thill indicators too that the Michigan steelhead anglers are using.
What are they?
It's essentially a slip bobber. I've seen his come across a lot more, and somehow Orvis stores are carrying those.
So with all of these different types, because a lot of times you go to a fly shop and you'll see a bunch of different ones. Is there one that you favor, either one of you guys favor over the other?
There's only one right strike indicator.
Okay, which one?
I don't know. I'm just waiting for somebody to tell me what it is.
It's Ray. I'll be honest with you. I've given up on the old thingamabobbers because they just chew up your line to no end.
Yeah.
I'm a little partial. At least lately, I've been fishing the airlocks just because they, even though they get a little bit more mass to them, a little bit more splash. When I fish them, I'm really not. You're not worried about it. At least for me, you know, scaring fish because you're already kind of throwing some lead at them, you know, with the split shot and all that stuff. I mean, I'll say it, it's steelhead fishing. So, you know, that's that's my main go-to when I'm using an indicator. Other than that, it's a fly. That's my preferred indicator.
Yeah, indicators, I would say, I mean, they're going to vary depending on preferences of the shop and that sort of thing. In our shop, we carry almost everything we just mentioned, and we sell a lot of thingamabobbers, a lot of airlocks, quite a few of the yarn indicators, fair numbers of like the football style indicators, pretty good numbers of the New Zealand yarn wool indicator too.
I'd like to mention one that I found because of an Instagram ad that has worked pretty well for me. I don't do a lot of like indicator style fishing, but again, I did it during the steelhead season, and it's the Ghost Tech ones. Have you tried those?
We carry those, but I have not tried them. I haven't.
It's a company out of Pennsylvania. It's one guy, I think. They're pretty good. They're supposed to like look like a foam bubble that's like floating by. They land nice and soft. They are kind of weird to cast, but
their shape looks a little weird. Maybe look like they wouldn't hold up a lot of weight, but just like a couple of tungsten nymphs probably.
Well,
fine.
you have to stack them.
Yeah, that's like a lot of work.
It's not that much. The only downside I would say is that they have like this tiny little like nut
Plastic.
that you have to screw on, and when it's cold and you're steelhead fishing, that's just like the worst. But I've used them for people that like, are like learning, and I think that they're nice. Like, you know, they're just like light, and they're like they land very softly, and
they look kind of like reusable pulsa, the little foam pulsa indicators that are sticky. They look kind of like a reusable. I mean, they're not the same shape, but I guess to me they look like they'd hold up similar amounts of weight and would be a little more reusable than the pulses.
Right? Yeah, they are. They last forever.
Cool. Yeah, there's lots of different indicators. There is no right one. I was teasing about there only being one right indicator. Everybody has their favorites. I think it's best to have the smallest indicator you can get away with and still support the amount of weight that you need below it.
True.
Smaller because then it hits the water softer, which is kind of really the only drawback to an indicator. I mean, a giant indicator, once it hits the water, drifting down the river, 20 feet past where it landed, it's not bothering fish anymore. But when it hits a big giant indicator, especially one with a little more density to it, can scare some fish right when it impacts the water versus something that's pretty light like yarn or those light little foam indicators hit the water quite soft and are less likely to spook fish. The disadvantage to them is they don't often hold up very much weight. So you kind of have to weigh what are you going to encounter that day. Do you need 4 big split shot to get down, or you just need 1 tiny split shot to get down?
And now, a word from our sponsors.
From the vise to the boat, to the bank, to those moments you connect to a fish, Loon Outdoors is with you every step of the way, with tools designed at the bench and on the water to help make your best day on the water better.
So I would encourage people to carry a range of indicators, different sizes, different types. I think you'll gravitate towards probably a medium size most of the time, right? We sell a lot of like the 1/2 inch size, maybe 1/2 to 3/4 inch size thingamabobbers, and airlocks are most popular in our shop for sure.
And there's also, you can make your own. That's kind of the Pat Dorsey one, which is actually in your Modern Nymphing movie for fishing deep pools, and I've made those, and those are nice too. They land very softly, and
the yarn lands kind of like a big dry fly would, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's an option. But Ray actually brought up kind of slyly in the background there. His favorite indicator is a fly. So a lot of people do that too. They fish what's called dry dropper, or if you're in New Zealand,
nymph under dry.
But
in the UK, a duo.
Is that what it's called, a duo? In Spain, isn't it
a tandem?
Yeah, I think that's what they call it. Yeah, so basically, you give the fish the option to either hit the dry fly on top or the nymph underneath it, but the dry fly also acts as a suspender, shout out George Daniel, to the nymph. So it's a flotation device for the nymph that's trailing behind.
No, that one is a suspension device.
Yeah, it is, for sure. If you're doing standard, run-of-the-mill, what's been nymphing for a long time, what most people were doing, at least in the States, I can't speak for Europe, I don't know if they were actually doing this that much there, but in the United States, indicator-style nymphing has kind of been the industry standard for many, many years, and that's kind of the spiel with it. You have an indicator that's something else other than your flies that floats along like a bobber would, and it tells you when.
Yeah, it tells you when you're contacting bottom, whether or not you've got a fish eating your fly. You can watch the indicator for drift purposes too, so you can see whether it's moving faster than the current. in which it's drifting, and so on, so you can manipulate the rest of the line. It has a lot of, there's a lot of reasons to use the indicator. It's more than just indicating strikes, right?
Right.
It helps you know your nymphs are down in the zone, helps you know whether or not you're getting a drag-free drift, and so on.
And we're going to get to a hypothetical situation when we're on the river in 2 seconds, but I just wanted to finish up with the setup part of it because we kind of have it all set up. The only thing is that there's a missing little part here. So if I have an indicator, well, there's two. The first one would be, if you have an indicator, most people's number one question is, well, how far up this leader do I put it? Like, how much length do I have off the back of it? And, how do I gauge how deep I need to be and all those things? Those are kind of the big problems in nymph fishing that need to be solved in order to be successful. Mm-hmm. So most people say you should have your flies 1.5 times as long as the water depth. Is that correct?
That's one way to look at it, I guess. I would, you have a good point. We're missing a lot of the critical rigging portion here. So to your question there, I would say you want that distance from your indicator to your flies at least 2 times the depth of the water, and more commonly 2.5 to 3 times the depth of the water.
Nice. Okay.
The reason for that is in our minds, we often think the flies are fishing vertically below the indicator.
Right.
In which case, if it was 6 feet of water, then if your fly is down 6 feet from your indicator, then it would get down. But they sink at an angle, usually probably in the neighborhood of a 30, 35 degree angle, somewhere in there. So it takes a lot more distance to get down from the surface from our indicator all the way down to the river bottom than you would think, because the river surface is moving a little bit faster than the bottom. The way that rig ends up going downstream is just that shallow angle necessitates a longer distance. So, around here we get people all the time in the shop asking us how they can catch more fish on the local waters, and they're nymph fishing. And when they're fishing indicator rigs, we always joke the difference between a really good angler and a really good fly fisher, nymph fisher, let's say, and a poor nymph fisher is about another foot and a half of length of tippet and one more split shot.
Right.
You got to get down a little deeper, and that's usually with a little more weight and a little more distance between your indicator and flies.
Right. I think it was Joe Humphreys that said that the difference between a good nympher and a great one is one split shot.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time around Joe, but I've heard that lots of times, so that's good to credit to Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's other parts that we're missing too. So you're going to often use that. We talked about a leader. I would argue it's best not to use a taper leader for most nymph fishing situations. Mm-hmm. I wrote an article for Fly Fisher Magazine a long while back called Low and Slow that you could probably find on the internet. Okay. That goes through some different rigs for nymphing. I think in Gary Borger's book Presentation, I believe it is. I could be wrong on this. I sometimes blur the books I've read to go together, but I think it's in Presentation where he talks about a nymphing leader where he uses some Maxima Chameleon for a butt section that's significantly thinner than a traditional butt section of a tapered leader, and it's significantly shorter. And that's kind of the same thing that we use around here for a bounce rig, for instance, or a lot of people call it a drop shot rig.
Right.
Where rather than a tapered leader with 60% of leader being butt section, you're shrinking the butt section down, so you're building your own leaders, terminating the butt section at a tippet ring, and then from the tippet ring down, you're using nothing but pretty thin tippet. Maybe on the thick end of things 3x for most trout fishing. Most of the time, a lot of local guys are using 4 or 5x for the main part of their leader, and then going down to 5 or 6x to the flies.
Okay. There's a good illustration of the bounce rig in George Daniels' new nymphing book, so if you guys want to check that out, we'll put it in the show notes.
Perfect.
It's a good book. It's really good, and it's got a little description of that for those of you that need the visual. I'm one of those people.
Yeah,
so.
George has some awesome nymphing books for sure. Check those out. So you're going to have, you could have weights above or below the flies. We've been describing that drop shot bounce rig with the weights below the flies, but you could have it, a lot of people call an inline rig with the weight above the flies, and then the flies tied in line, meaning they're tied, the first fly is tied to the eye of the hook, and the second fly you have the tippet tied to the bend of the hook on the first fly, and then you run a little tippet to your second fly. They're trailing behind the weight. You could also attach 2 pieces of tippet to the eye of the first fly is another way to do that. So you have your weights above the flies, tippet coming down to your first fly, then you take a second piece of tippet tight to the eye of that first fly, and then tie the second fly on the terminal end of that added piece of tippet.
Yeah, I was going to ask you which one you prefer. If you like tying off the bend of the hook, which you would use a clinch knot for that.
Union knot would be great too. Yeah, a little stronger than a clinch, but a clinch would work great too.
Okay.
Which one I prefer? If I'm fishing indicator rig, I would prefer to have weight on the bottom, have a bounce rig, we call it locally, or a drop shot rig.
Okay.
That's not legal everywhere. You can't. Not every state allows you to have weight below the flies. So when we do that, we put the flies on dropper tags off the main line, so you're not tying anything in line. And the reason I like that is that when you have the weight on the bottom and the indicator above kind of keeping tension on it, you have flies between those two that are under tension, therefore you have a little bit of strike detection.
Okay.
Where if you have weight above the flies, your strike indicator is directly connected to your weight, but it's not necessarily directly connected to the flies. The flies could be upstream, downstream, up in the water column in relation to the weight. So, I'm not here to tell you can't catch fish that way. You certainly can. I fished that way a bunch and caught fish, but I don't think it's the improved method, if you were. If you could say good, better, best, I think best with an indicator is with weight on the bottom, flies on droppers so that they're both independent. And the other problem with an inline rig, in my opinion, is when you tie tippet to the front of the fly and tie tippet to the back of the fly, that first fly does not get a very natural drift. It's just got stiff tippet tied to both sides of it. So it doesn't drift very naturally, A, and B, the other problem with it is the fish can run into your tippet on two sides of it. So they can, even if they're going to try and eat it, they could just not be able to get it in their mouth because they run into tippet.
Right. That makes sense.
Versus if you have flies tied on a tag end, like a dropper, off the main line, there's only one line coming into it, and they can kind of swivel around the main line and be a little bit more at the mercy of the current and perhaps look a bit more lifelike and natural during the drift.
Here they do the steelheaders do kind of a modified bounce rig where they actually, they'll tie a dropper and they'll put the split shot on the dropper. And then off of that, they tie the two flies. They'll tie with the first fly and then another one off the end of that. But I think what you're saying is that still would mean that the weight is coming before the flies.
Yeah, I'm sure you'd catch fish that way. There's a few guys that do that around here too. I have no doubts that would work. I would still argue your strike detection is lessened that way compared to having weight on the bottom.
Makes sense.
And they may do it. Maybe you have to check your local laws. They may do it because it's not allowed to have weight on the bottom.
Okay, that's interesting. Something to look into.
Yeah.
All right, so for nymphing, we should talk a little bit about the types of material for your leader and tippet. There are two types available, nylon and fluorocarbon, and you could use both to catch fish, but I would argue that fluorocarbon has some advantages for nymph fishing. One, it's a tiny bit more dense than nylon, so it's going to cut through the water column just a tiny bit quicker. More importantly for me, it's more abrasion resistant than nylon, and it's not absorbing any water as you're fishing it, so it retains more strength over the course of the day. So again, you can use nylon to catch fish nymphing, but it's an advantage, I would argue, to use at least fluorocarbon tippet. Nylon leader works just fine up near the strike indicator, but using fluorocarbon tippet is again not necessary to catch fish, but just stacking the deck in your favor, just making it a little more long lasting and give you a little more strength over the course of the day.
Yeah, I've always used fluoride tippets. Those are my favorite for sure.
Yeah, you like the Crest or the Colgate style?
I'm kind of into Tom's. Keep it natural so the fish can't see it.
Not just the Chicago water fluoride?
No, not that. Not that.
I heard it's Florida carbon, right? It's all made in Florida?
Florida carbon, you are correct. And it lives forever
Florida
because
carbon.
as do everything from Florida. That made sense,
Wow.
right? As do
Really
everything.
good.
Me talk good when me talk fish.
Me talk.
There is one myth that I think we could dispel a bit, in that, at least in my opinion, and that is fluorocarbon is clearer than nylon, right? That's not a myth, that's a fact.
Okay.
However, I don't think the fish care. And the reason I say that is that, well, number one, we caught fish for a long time on nylon, and then well before any of us were alive, people were catching fish on gut leaders.
Right.
And you'll never convince me that if given the choice, fish just don't reason for starters, but if given the choice to focus on the negatives on your fly, and if you've got fluorocarbon or nylon tippet connected to the eye of the fly that are both quite clear, both virtually invisible, albeit fluoro is a teeny tiny bit more invisible, but why they would focus on that and not this, stainless steel, black nickel, or bronze colored hook that is thicker than the tippet and not clear at all coming out the other side of the fly?
Right.
Yeah.
I'll never understand, and you'll never convince me that makes any difference. So to me, I think one of the biggest myths in all fishing is that you should fish fluorocarbon because it's clear, because the fish see it. I just don't think that they are. I think they can see microscopic, midge pupa. I just don't think they're focusing on that. To me, it's more a matter of getting a good drag-free drift, which thinner tippet, whether you're using nylon or fluorocarbon, will help with. I don't think they're seeing the visibility part of it, but that's just my opinion.
Well, it's like kind of like the art of deception. It's like magic, It's like when you see a good magician, they're doing something to distract you from what's actually going on, and I feel like that's the same thing with the flies, with the nymphs that we have. The fish is looking at the actual nymph and not anything else, really.
Not the negatives, yeah. Now, after saying all that, I should say I only use fluorocarbon tippet. Right. But I'm not using it for clarity. I don't think the clarity makes any difference. I use it for abrasion resistance and density and those sorts of things. Right. And longevity. You don't have to replace it every few months when you haven't used the whole spool of it, right? It lasts longer than nylon. True. Anyway, lots of reasons to use fluorocarbon. The only one not to is that it's more expensive.
Okay, fair. That's good. I'm glad that we covered that. I also use fluorocarbon exclusively for nymphing.
I use it exclusively for everything. I don't carry nylon tippet at all.
That's what I was going to ask you was with your dry flies. I know that there's people that use fluoro and they actually want it to sink because the fish can see the shadow of the line on regular nylon. Is that the reason that you do that? Or?
Well, the reason I do it is because I don't find that it makes any difference to my dry fly fishing, and I don't want to carry double the amount of tippet on my vest at all times. I just don't find nylon tippet necessary. You can use fluoro for everything, so part of it's probably just because I'm cheap. You will have those that will tell you can't use fluorocarbon tippet for dry flies because it will sink your flies, but they're mistaken. Like fluorocarbon tippet is not tungsten impregnated sinking fly line. It's not pulling. It's like microscopically more dense than nylon, right? It's not pulling your flies under with like a sinking fly line. And then to your point, it's funny to hear like some of the real dry fly purists that will tell you have to fish nylon tippet, nylon leaders for dry flies. The next thing they tell you is one of their tricks is to make their nylon tippet sink, right? Because it does, to your point, it does cast less of a shadow when it's under the water rather than sitting on top of the surface.
Right.
And so to me, I go, well, why not just cut out the middleman here and
makes sense,
and use a fluorocarbon that might rest right in the film anyway. It's not going to it's not sinking 6 inches below the surface, 12 inches under, pulling your fly down. It just might rest in the meniscus, in the that surface tension a tiny bit more than the nylon will. Maybe cast less of a shadow, and you don't have to carry double the number of spools.
That's good to know. I'm going to stop carrying nylon.
I wish you could see
again, you can carry nylon. Nylon's not going to hurt anything for dry flies. I don't think either.
But my tippet spool is like
matters.
12 inches long because I'm carrying double of everything.
You get those giant. You have 14 spools of tippet because you've got a full run of it from 2 or 3x all the way through 7x.
Exactly.
Nylon and fluorocarbon. And next thing you know, you could have an extra Subway sandwich in your pack every day rather than tippet.
I've been using a box of Ritz crackers to put on my tippet spools in.
Don't get it wet.
I wish you could have just seen my brain turn inside out through all of that. That was beautiful.
That's good. That's why we're here.
So again, you can use nylon for dry flies. That's not going to hurt anything. I just don't think that you. I guess I disagree with the people that say you can't use fluorocarbon with dry flies. I know for a fact you can because it's all I've used for the last almost 20 years, and I catch lots of fish on dry flies. It doesn't affect anything.
Cool. Yeah, I had heard of people also doing they'll do a whole nylon leader and then the last 2 feet of it they'll put fluoro on so that it will sink so it doesn't cast a shadow. I've heard of people doing that too, so that's why I was curious.
And that brings up a good point. I wouldn't suggest using an entire fluorocarbon leader for dry flies because the butt section of the leader is thicker, may have a bit more density, and could pull. It's not going to sink your fly necessarily, but it could make the butt end of the leader sit in a little more, so when you lift your fly off it's going to get pulled through the water and make a little more noise. Okay. You could combat all of that by just putting some Loon Payette paste or mucilin on your leader, be it fluorocarbon or nylon. You could make your leader float if you want to.
Yeah.
But that said, I think that's a good point. I use basically nylon leaders and fluorocarbon tippet for my dry fly fishing. That's a good delineation there.
Okay. I don't know. I think maybe for this, since you're our guide, you should kind of walk us through what kind of water we want to be fishing when we're nymphing. Let's just say that we've hiked through some sort of forest brush and we just got to the river. So we're going to have to kind of look for fishy looking water. So maybe you can explain that to us. And then we're going to have to come up with a game plan to cast our flies to them.
Well, so we're walking through a beautiful deciduous forest.
I love that.
And
Yes.
there are ferns and redwoods, and I don't even know what deciduous means. I'm using terms above and beyond my pay grade here. But you're walking through a beautiful forest. You get to the river. I mean, what are you looking for? You're looking for all kinds of things, because indicator nymphing is a very versatile technique that can be used, as we were describing earlier, with no weight and like nothing more than a floating dry fly or a tiny little foam indicator that you might be able to fish a tiny or even large emerger that's hardly has any weight at all, or in a very spooky situation. Or you could use a strike indicator that's giant, that is the size of a golf ball, or some of the guides out on the Green River here in Utah use water balloons filled with air. You can get pretty dirty with a strike indicator rig and fish crazy long leaders with way too much weight than should be humanly used on a fly fishing outfit, and then get right to the bottom, and there's all kinds of between, right?
Right.
Regular stuff between. But so if you're if we're painting a picture of what I would consider my favorite way, my favorite water type to fish an indicator rig in, it would be kind of more of a riffle run glide type of situation, where I can stay in one position and make slight changes to my indicator rig with different weights, different flies, and moving the indicator up and down, different amounts of weight, I should say, and different distances from indicator to weights, and then changing flies. And I can cover all kinds of water types there, and all kinds of depths. So if you're in the back of the run where it starts to tail out and slow down, you might be able to have your indicator and flies closer. As you move to the deeper part of the run, you might have to move your indicator up, add a little more weight. As you head to the front of the pool or the riffles as it drop into the pool, you might need to move your indicator a little closer because it's not as deep, but add extra weight to get the flies down fast because the water's moving quicker.
Okay.
And
that's a good tip.
After that, it's just a matter of fine tuning that system. And the $1 million question that everybody asks in the fly shop is, well, how many weights do I need for river X? And the question is, at what flow and which part of the river?
Right.
And, there is no answer for that. So there's going to be a learning curve for everybody that's learning how to nymph fish.
So how do you know if you're actually in the zone or not?
Yeah, you're going to have to start adding weight and start with less than you think. Probably start with one split shot, let's say, or one weighted fly. You don't have to use split shot. You could just be using weighted flies below an indicator. You're going to add a certain amount of weight and see what happens. And if you're never contacting bottom during the drift, then you probably need to move your indicator up and you need to add more weight.
Okay, but first we need to cast the thing out there, right?
Sure, you're going to have to cast it out into the river where you think there are fish and make a few drifts and see what happens, right?
Okay, so we get to your section of the river and we see a spot that we think might hold fish, right?
Okay.
Let's just say that there's a depression, because you like talking about being depressed.
I don't, actually. I don't like being depressed. But I do like depressions I do like the depressions in the river because they hold fish. And that makes me happy.
All right, so you got your polarized glasses
I beat you to it, Ray. I beat you. Depressions make me happy. I like where your mind is.
We find a depression. We're using our cool polarized glasses. We can see through the water. We see that there's a little depression. There could be a fish there. We're not sure. So we're going to go ahead. Are we using an overhand style cast? Are we doing a roll cast? How are we getting our flies out there?
That's a good question. You could do both of those, but it's usually with strike indicator, split shot, couple of flies. It's usually less prone to tangles if you use just kind of a roll cast or a water load for sure. Certainly a very skilled caster with lighter amounts of weight could just do an overhead cast, no problem. But, that's going to, again, situational. Our listeners are going to love that word, but it is situational.
So let's just say that if we do an overhand cast, we have to do it a little bit wider, right? Because we got a bunch of junk on this thing. We've got an indicator, we've got some split shot most likely, or if not, we have a weighted fly, right? So It's not like we're casting a dry fly right now. So
you'll want a more open loop cast, I think is what you're getting at, right?
Yes, sir.
That's a good point.
Okay.
Very good idea.
Okay, and if not, we'll be doing some sort of roll cast maybe.
And if we don't do either of those, we'll be doing some sort of untangling.
Exactly.
Which is part of fishing and is going to happen at some point anyway. No matter how careful you are, you're going to get tangled now and then.
Sure.
But hopefully with these tips that Pablo's thrown out here, you're going to minimize that. You're going to lessen the amount of tangling you're doing.
Yeah, look behind you, look above you, make sure that you're not about to cast into a tree. And then
Which we should also mention that as you I don't know if you want to call it graduate, but if you go from casting a dry fly, single dry fly is pretty easy. You can still tangle it, and we all do. You're still going to get some knots in the tippet and leader, but as you get used to that, you should be tangling it less and less and less. If you go from fishing a single dry to a dry and a dropper, you're going to experience, so you have to envision yourself spending a little more time on tangling, because when you add a second fly into the rig, you're going to get more tangles until you get used to handling that rig. How tight can you have your loop? How much energy do you need to give it to get it to turn over? And on and on. And as you add a strike indicator and a fly or two and some weights, that's going to get more complicated still, so you're going to have to expect a few tangles. But as you get more used to it, you're going to tangle less. So I guess my point here is, don't get too frustrated when you very first try a nymph rig and you get it all tangled up. Don't throw in the towel and say, I'm never doing this again.
Yeah,
everybody starts there.
Yeah.
Everybody starts tangling, but you're going to get it. You're going to spend a little time with it. It's going to become second nature, and before long, you won't be tangling hardly at all.
Yeah, and the other thing that happens when you tangle a lot is you get faster at making the rig.
Untangling.
So one tip I will give you about tangling is just take all the nymphs off and start over. Because if you sit there and you try and untangle it, it's just going to take way longer than actually just tying the knots again. Trust us.
Yeah, it's usually, and if it's a really bad tangle, it's usually quicker just to cut all the tippet off and start fresh, right?
Yep.
Totally, yeah.
If you think it's just a couple of twists or a couple of little knots that are not tightened down, then I like your plan. Just cut the flies off so you're not dealing with flies, and just pull the tippet through there. Much easier.
Yeah.
Perfect.
All right, so let's just say we didn't tangle. We cast it out there. It's looking
Nailed
good.
it.
We're going to want to cast, if we have a depression that we found, we want to cast upstream of it so that the flies have time to sink down and get to the zone in time, correct?
Correct. We're presenting flies upstream of our position, or up and across most commonly, right?
Yeah.
So the current is coming at us, and we are fishing so that the current is drifting our flies. After we make a cast, the indicator and flies are drifting back downstream towards us, or out slightly into the current, but downstream towards our position.
Yeah, maybe like up and across, maybe across-ish. That's probably a good place to start.
Yep.
Okay,
Perfect.
and then so we cast it out. Everything looks like it's working fine. What's up with this mending situation? We talked about it with the dry fly fishing. Is there a drift issue here when we were dealing with an indicator also? Like, do we get drag from an indicator?
Yeah, there certainly can be, depending on where you are, what the current is like where you're standing versus where you're trying to fish. Most commonly, right, it's rare that you can just throw a cast and just let it ride.
Yeah.
It's much more common when you're nymph fishing that you have to make a cast and immediately mend line, reposition line upstream of the indicator, or at least throw some slack at it to get it to drift drag free. And then the current between yourself, the conflicting current between yourself and the indicator, absorbs all of that, and you throw another mend. So on most strike indicator rigs, in most situations, you're going to be throwing, I would argue, on an average drift, I don't know, on a medium-sized river, you're probably going to maybe have the flies drift, what do you think, 20 or 30 feet, guys, max?
Yeah.
You could do it longer than that in a really big river, but most places it might be 5 to 10 feet. But even in that 5 to 10, 15 foot of drift, you're going to probably throw 3 or 4 mends at the rig just to get a drag-free drift through it. And by mending, again, we mean you're repositioning the line. So in most cases, when you're fishing upstream, you're going to be throwing slack line, fly line upstream of the indicator, or up and slightly across stream from the indicator.
What tells us that it's actually starting to drag? What are the signs of this disease that's happening to our line?
The indicator is moving faster than the current in which it's drifting. It's leaving a little wake. It's got a little bit of tension. Basically, you want it moving as slow as possible while still drifting. You don't want it dead stopped, because that would mean that you have too much weight on and you're pegged to the bottom, right? So you need it to be cruising along, but you're having to watch for visual cues on that indicator as it drifts to make sure that it's moving at that same speed of current you're trying to fish.
And sometimes, you'll notice that your line is getting taken by the current. Your fly line's downstream of the indicator. So if you can think about this visually, you start to get this kind of U belly shape, and that starts to pull the indicator down faster than the actual current. So in that case also, you have to kind of flip your fly line above the indicator so that it drifts. And
introduce some slack.
Yes, and introduce some slack, thank you, so that it drifts freely. Another thing that we should talk about really briefly is just that a lot of times people see the indicator drop and they think it's a fish, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it's also your fly ticking bottom. Or
your weights.
Or your weights, right. and that's supposed to be something favorable from everything that I've kind of been heard and have read. Do you agree with that? You want to be ticking bottom every once in a while?
Yeah, most definitely. I don't think you want it to just be like dragging bottom, where your weights are just dragging along, but you want them certainly to be contacting bottom. And again, depending on how you have it rigged, like a bounce rig or a drop shot rig, you should probably be contacting bottom a bit more than an inline rig.
Mm-hmm.
But either one, you want to make sure that it is contacting bottom throughout the, not the entire drift, but certainly at some points during the drift.
Okay.
I would describe it as you make the cast, the flies and weights sink, and they contact bottom. Then the indicator kind of gets tight and moves it along, and then it drifts for a foot or two, and it contacts bottom, and then it gets lifted back up by the indicator, and proceeds to do that throughout the drift, where it's ticking bottom every 2 or 3 seconds through the drift.
I would say when you're first starting out, when you see that thing tick bottom the first couple times, it's not going to hurt to set the hook, because you're kind of learning what it looks like, the difference between the takes, and who knows, maybe you catch a fish right then and there, and that's totally possible. So
agreed.
Like they always say, the mentors say, hook sets are free. I heard
Sets
that in Lance's one of his videos. I'm not sure which one, but
set it, don't regret it. Better set than sorry.
That's
How many
right.
cliches do you want?
yeah, so just feel free to set the hook haphazardly, especially in the beginning, and then eventually you'll be like, okay, I'm setting too much, and then you can kind of like start to get it dialed. But it's
I like
definitely
that
better.
advice.
It's definitely better than not setting, because then you could potentially be missing fish that you didn't even know you had.
Right.
And once you start catching fish, then you start to realize what's what. It's getting used to this thing that we're doing. So it just takes time and takes a little bit of experience, and that's how it is.
And that's the same with adding weight and moving your indicator up and down. Nobody has a formula that tells you got to do it exactly like this every time you go to that river or that run. It's you're going to be able to just look at the water as you get some familiarity with the rig and the system. You're going to look at the water. You're going to know how much weight to put on, to start out, and then you're going to fine tune it from there. You're going to take a guesstimate as to where you're going to place your indicator, and if you're never contacting bottom, you're going to adjust as needed. If you're getting bottom too fast, you're going to adjust as needed by removing weight, removing distance, and on and on. And then just like Pablo's saying, you're going to set the hook on everything to begin with, because you don't know what is and isn't a fish. And then after 100 hook sets with nothing there, you can probably lay off a little until you see something that's maybe a little more obvious of a take. And then the other thing is when you're nymphing, with in relation to drag, you want to make sure that you're introducing that slack and getting a drag-free drift throughout the entire presentation if possible. I would, again, we joked earlier about the best fishermen have one more split shot on and maybe have a little more distance between their indicator and flies. The other thing that sets people apart, like on our local tailwaters, is I'm floating by in a boat, versus wade fishing. You don't get to see a lot of people. When you're floating by in a boat and you encounter wading anglers over the river miles, the difference between the people that are hooked up when you go by and the people that are not missing any fish is usually that they have tons of drag on every single drift. Mm-hmm. They have no idea how to mend and manipulate the line to create a drag-free presentation.
Okay, so you heard it here. Practice that. Pay attention to drag, even if it's a drag.
It's not a drag. Trust me, you'll enjoy it.
When I think of like traditional, conventional fishing, I've fished a worm before. It's like you see that bobber drop. Most of the people that do this have been accustomed to doing it in lakes, so there's not a lot of movement of the current there, so it just drops down. But in a river, a lot of times the bobber, strike indicator, suspension device will stop, it will tilt, it will kind of duck, roll. Sometimes it dunks too, but it's not as just plain and simple as just like a dunk. It's a bunch of different things. So you should be paying close attention to that thing, and especially at first, just setting anytime you see it do that. Eventually you'll start to realize that it'll start turning a certain way every time it ticks bottom and stuff like that, and you'll be able to get it more dialed. But let's say that we actually have a fish hit. Let's say it's a really obvious one. It dunks a little bit. How do we set the hook on this thing?
So you're going to set the hook. By that we mean you're going to lift the rod and get tight to the fish. Generally, I would suggest setting downstream whenever possible, and if the indicator rig is downstream of your position, then set kind of downstream and to the side towards the bank to get tight. So you're pulling into the corner of the fish's mouth. You want to set the hook straight out of the fish's mouth, if that makes sense. So if the indicator rig ends up, on a long drift, ends up downstream of your position, you don't want to set directly back upstream. You want to set either straight up to try and pull the flies into the roof of the fish's mouth, or sideways towards the bank that nearest bank to pull into the corner of the fish's mouth.
Okay.
And you just got to be able to remove enough slack to get tight. So we talked a little bit about mending earlier. We should mention here that when you're mending, you're oftentimes introducing slack. You're adding extra lengths of line between yourself and the indicator in an effort to get a drag-free drift. There's a way you have to manage that. If you add way too much slack, you might get a really great drag-free drift, but you can't take out enough slack to get tight when the fish eats. So you have to add just enough slack to allow you to get a drag-free presentation, but making it possible to remove that slack with just a quick rod movement to get tight to the fish.
Okay. It's a lot to think about, but once you're doing it, it becomes second nature. So, don't cry yet, ladies and gentlemen. It's not as hard as it seems. But let's say we have this fish on. One of the things that we hadn't mentioned when it comes to fighting fish, we talked a little bit about it in the dry fly podcast, but one thing that I would like to mention is if you have a bigger fish and you can tell that it's bigger because it's fighting harder, sometimes like the little guys fight harder, you think they're big and they're not, but generally it feels heavier, it's fighting a little bit harder, you can't move it as easily with your rod, you can't steer it as easily. Basically, it's optimal if you can get downstream of the fish. And maybe Lance will be like, no, what you're saying is wrong. But
nope, that's right. You need to be downstream of the fish. The fish needs to be upstream of you.
Exactly, because it's a lot easier to lose a fish just because of the hook angle of what you're playing it at when the fish is downstream from you. One of the first lessons I learned in nymphing was when I hooked that gigantic steelhead. Before I hooked that one, I had hooked another one and I lost it because I didn't move at all. I just stood there. And it was one of my favorite lessons in fly fishing, and I've taken it with me everywhere. But my buddy Ryan, who was guiding me at the time, he got so upset. So the next time I caught that big steelhead, when I hooked the next one, he was like, move your feet, you got to move your feet. And I started following the fish and I got myself downstream of it, and it was much easier to fight it. So if you can, you want to think about where you are in position to the fish once it's hooked. If you can get downstream of it, that's best case scenario. And also, where are you going to land this thing? Because if you're in a place where if you take one step, you're going to fall in 8 feet, you probably want to get to a place that's like a little bit shallower, a little bit easier to have room to move to angle the net where you need it to be and the rod so that you can bring the fish to hand. Sometimes if it's a little fish, you don't have to go through all this pageantry, but if it's a bigger fish, all those things are just going to help aid you in actually getting this thing to hand.
Good tips.
Move your feet, okay? Get downstream with the fish, okay?
The last thing that I would like you to do is just go over one more time what you did last time with the dry fly. The way that you bring the fish to the net, because it was very specific. You had a C shape in the rod. You had it on one side of the net, and you kind of dragged the fish when in an upstream position. You had it current bringing it to you as you kind of swung the rod to the left. Can you kind of walk me through this a little bit?
Yeah, so you've made a cast. Let's say you're looking upstream, the river, as you face upstream, the current's coming at you, and you're on a left bank as you look upstream, right? Correct, I should say. You're on the left bank as you look upstream, and you make a cast that's kind of up and across more towards the middle or right side of the river, and you hook a fish. You immediately want to try and get that fish. You want to, as you mentioned, you want to keep it upstream of you, but you want to move it towards your position. So I would ideally hook the fish and then move my rod low and parallel to the water, creating that C shape in the rod, kind of pushing the reel out towards the fish. So I'm using the entire rod to try and turn the fish and get it towards my bank.
He's kind of doing like that old school gangsta car steering wheel turn thing where you've
got the little knob on the steering wheel, so you just stick your hand on it and it spins all the way around like a bus.
In the El Camino?
The El Camino, exactly. So yeah, you just kind of, you're doing that. We'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Anyway, yeah, I have to go through it in the motions in my head. Physically, I'm doing it as well. So you set the hook, you move the rod parallel to the water surface and to the upstream side of you to the nearest bank. So we're going to try and direct the fish upstream of our position and to our bank, right? Now, if it's a really large fish, you may not have enough control to do that immediately. As Pablo was saying a minute ago, you may have to move, physically move your position to try and keep yourself downstream of the fish. And you don't, that's not always possible either. Sometimes there are situations where, we're going to say that one a lot, where you just can't go downstream. Then you're just at the mercy of the fish and what it gives you as you're fighting that fish. But ideally, let's say a medium-sized trout, you've hooked it, you're going to move that rod parallel to the water towards the near bank and applying side pressure to the fish to try and direct it upstream of you. Then you're just keeping tension on it, trying to wait it out. As it starts to tire, you want to move it directly upstream of your position with a low rod, and then once it gets really tired and it's starting to show signs that it's ready to be, captured, whether hopefully that's in a net for the fish's sake, but you then slide your rod to more vertical angle, then the fish comes directly to you because the fish is upstream of your position and the current will pull it directly into your position and into your net. The opposite of that would be if you were to land it downstream of you, the current is always pulling the fish away from you, and that's where you're likely to break the fish off or tear it out of the little bit of flesh that you have the fish hooked, by which the fish is hooked. So your best situation is always to try and land a fish upstream of you.
And I think when you're first learning, I know I did this. I got really aggressive with staying downstream, and I think it's just do it. And eventually you'll get comfortable landing fish, and you'll know when you have to really work yourself downstream or when you can kind of fight the thing and bring it up towards you. There's a balance to it. It's like we're saying with all this, it just takes a little bit of experience. But if you've been listening since the first podcast, at this point you would have a lot of experience because you've been practicing casting, you've been practicing all these things that we've been talking about, and you're virtually a pro.
Level up.
That's pretty good. I think we're good there for nymphing. The next podcast, we're going to be talking about Euro nymphing, which is a super hot topic, and Lance is a consummate expert on this, and he has even been a pioneer in the subject, so we have a lot to cover on the next one and really pick his brain about. But for everyone else who doesn't want a Euro nymph, you might still learn something about how to do regular nymph fishing just from listening to the tactics that we're going to be using on the Euro podcast as well. So we thank you guys a lot for being here. Lance, thanks for your knowledge. It's been super, super legit. We've learned a lot.
No, thanks to you and Ray for giving me some direction, keeping me on the path here, and not talking about human hair flies too much.
Or suspension devices.
Yeah.
Suspension devices. We love you, George.
Yeah, we love you, George. Next podcast, we'll be tying flies from midair, suspended from the ceiling, using human hair.
Did I mention I'm busy next week? I don't know what you guys are up to.
All right, with that, Ray, why don't you say bye-bye, and we're out.
See you, folks.
Love
See
y'all.
you guys.
This was a Raul Maria production.
That's talent.